Hello, and welcome to Real Talk with Community with the Impact Movement. I'm Jimmy McGee, and I'm the CEO, president of the Impact Movement, and we have a whole bunch of guests. This is a special edition. So next Monday at 8 p.m., we'll have our next installment, as we always do every Monday at 8 o'clock, and we'll be talking about how to do ministry to Black students under COVID-19 with some other partners. But saying that, putting it everybody on as guests, make sure you mute yourself. There we go. Start your watch party. All right, we got watch parties going now with Facebook. So tonight is the conversation about living with trauma. As everyone knows, around the country, the video of Ahmaud Arbery was released, and people unfortunately saw his tragic murder all on Facebook, all across the country. And I know my Facebook news feed was filled with stories and sentiment and emotions and anger and a variety of feelings that we had. And so tonight, this great panel, we're here together to discuss this. And I want to say too that for many of you, you might have got an earlier PDF that only had the brothers on here. But this is a global issue that both men and women are struggling with in our community. And so we invited two sisters in with us. So if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce everybody and then give everyone a chance to give some opening comments. Let me start with Rebecca Wheeler-Walston. She lives in Williamsburg, Virginia. If you know anything about the 1619 Project, that's where she lives. She's married and got two kids there. She's been homeschooling and doing all this good work at home. She's the general counsel for the Impact Movement. And she's got a pretty illustrious educational career, going to Berkeley, going to UCLA, going to RTS. But most recently, she's been trained as a facilitator in trauma for the Allender Center. So she's gone through 3 installments, and she's now officially a facilitator. So she's with us. Right across from me to the side is Charles Gilmer. Charles Gilmer is a graduate of UPenn. He's married to Rebecca. I'm sure she's in close proximity to him now, if not looking at it on Facebook. Charles recently graduated from Princeton Seminary and is now pursuing his PhD in New Testament at Duquesne University, a Catholic school in Pittsburgh, PA, not too far from his home state of West Virginia. But the one thing I'll say about Charles Gilmer, he's my predecessor. He is the founder and former president of the Impact Movement. Right beneath him is Josh Igwe. Josh Igwe I met when he was an intern with Crew, and now he's raising money, and he's a full-time staff with Crew, a graduate of Ohio University, and he's living in the Cleveland area, serving with Neo Impact, Northeastern Ohio. He's on a Crew team, but he works with Darnell Wilson and Shayla Mays as well. He's with us. Jazzy Johnson, and I won't tell you her other name, but Jazzy is what she prefers. Jazzy, besides that beautiful smile she has, is brilliant. She's a graduate of Northwestern University, and she just completed her first year of her Master of Divinity at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. And last but not least, and certainly not the smallest, is Wendell Moss. Wendell is a friend of mine. We used to work together, but only recently have I called him a friend. He's a former staff within a varsity, just like Jazzy. I didn't say that. He graduated, I believe, from Eastern Illinois. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
And he also went and graduated from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and he's a licensed practitioner counselor in Seattle. So this is our group tonight, and we're gonna try to run the gamut. Now, as we get going, many of us here have all hit watch parties. So we have a number of people accumulating on our watch party on our Facebook page. But tonight we want to answer questions as much as dialogue with each other. If you want to submit a question to us, you have to leave the watch party because we won't see it in the impact. We have 2 people working behind the scenes, both on YouTube and Facebook Live on the Impact Movement page. So if you would like to post a question for us to answer, please post your questions on the Impact page, the Impact Movement page for Facebook, or on YouTube Live. If not, please feel free to join us. We're welcoming you into our conversation. And let me just open it up for a little bit for everyone to go around and just give some opening statements in terms of your reaction to seeing the video, if you saw it, of Ahmaud Arbery's murder, and what are some of your initial feelings and emotions? And again, since we went around the block, I'm gonna start with Rebecca, then go to Jazzy, and then I hit the brothers. Go ahead.
I watched the video. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I watched the video a couple of days ago, and to be honest, my first reaction was very muted, which I think speaks to how familiar and common this feels. There's almost a desensitization that I felt about watching the video. And it seemed to me that various other images started to flash across my mind. Images I have of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Philando Castile, and the list goes on and on. And it probably took me a couple of days to be able to tap into what I was actually feeling as a result of the video and the story that swirled around it.
Okay. Jazzy, what were your initial thoughts if you saw the video?
Yeah, so at first I tried to avoid watching the video. I tried to avoid even engaging fully with my feelings. I like cooked a bunch and avoided it altogether because I saw what was happening, but then I couldn't any longer. And when I finally engaged with the video, when I first read through descriptions and some of the reporting before actually watching it, and my reactions came of like the very reactions that lynchings try to pull out of Black folks. I felt a lot of fear. And I've been appreciating that people have been using the language of lynching because that's what this was. And we haven't always used that language in more contemporary times for what we've seen happening to Black bodies, but it is. And so I felt fear. Newly living in Georgia as like someone who likes to go on walks. I didn't want to go on walks or runs this week. And it was a real thing. When I saw a white pickup truck outside of my house, I felt fear. And that is what happens in the psychology of lynching for Black folks, is that we are to fear and to stay in our place. And that's what I felt. And I was really sad that I felt that way.
Okay. What about you, Josh? What were some of your feelings engaging this?
Yeah, so when I first saw it come across my timeline on Twitter, I think it was Tuesday evening, like maybe afternoon, right after it was put out. And so it wasn't on the news yet, so I wasn't even sure what had happened. And so I saw the video, without thinking about it too much. I clicked on it and saw it and was just shocked. Didn't really know what to feel, but I just was in disbelief. I couldn't believe what I saw. And then the thought came, here we go again, it's happened again. And then I saw that there was no arrest even. And once I saw that, I was done. So I kind of shut it off and try not to think about it. But that didn't last too long. But I felt anger rise up inside of me too. A lot of anger at first. It felt like almost a volcano of emotions was welling up inside of me that first day before I went to sleep that night.
Wow. And Charles, what about you? How did you chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was actually writing a paper when all this was going on, and for a PhD seminar, and had just written one in which I drew a lot on James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is a very rich treatment of the ways in which Black religion, Black Christianity, drew on the crucifixion story to find a sense of hope, and that ultimately God was going to vindicate our people. And of course, what's challenging is, it's 2020, and we've had a Black president and yet we're still dealing with these kinds of incidents. And you know, it's a little bit of a feeling of the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's been a lot of discussion and writing actually about the ways in which what Katie Walker Grimes calls anti-Black supremacy. It's not just white supremacy; it's specifically anti-Black. She's a white Catholic sister. Wrote this book talking about that, documenting that history. So I think that you know, just the ways in which it is enduring and continues to kind of dog our steps.
Well, and let's end with you, Wendell. What were some of your initial thoughts? And I'm gonna have a follow-up question to start with you, Wendell, afterwards. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think when I saw it, I believe it was actually Wednesday morning, and I saw the link to the video, and I just went straight to the video. And when I watched it, actually, a part of me just went numb. My jaw dropped. I went numb, and I remember out of my mouth just came, "Here it is again." It was just that clear. Here it is again. And my following thought is, how are they gonna get out of this one? Somehow, this video will be made fake news. And how are they going to get out of this? And I think once that feeling hit, then anger and even just feelings of rage came. Not just because of Ahmaud, but what I know is going to happen after. Will he get justice for real? That is what brought even more.
Wow. And so the emotions that you just said, so let me just say this real clear. Ahmaud Arbery was not killed last week. He was killed in late February. And for many of us in Georgia, we had not seen a video, but we were aware of this violent act. When the video was finally released, that's when the outrage began to just take over and actually spread like a virus, like COVID-19, throughout the whole countryside, from people, certainly Black people, but white people, Asian people, Latino, Native people across the country finally join into this trauma. So why don't we talk about this for a little bit, starting with you, Wendell. You know, a few years ago, most of us on this participating today came to an event that Impact and the Allender Center pulled off called Race, Trauma, and the Gospel. And we're going to try to interact with all of these terms, a little bit of theology, a little bit of law, but certainly a little bit of trauma. What is trauma? Because you said something already, Wendell. You said, how are they going to get away with this before? So give me an idea of what is trauma and connect that to the statement, how are they going to get away with this again? Go ahead and talk to it.
Yeah, I like this trauma, just a basic definition. It just says a disturbing and distressing event. I mean, that's simple. We're talking about trauma. But what's particular about trauma is that trauma affects the body and trauma affects the brain. And so when we're talking about trauma, whether it be a small trauma or big trauma, it has an impact. Even if the event is just for seconds, it can last a lifetime. Now, as a Black man, when I saw that video, it wasn't just one traumatic event. It was trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. So when I said, how are they going to get away with this? Again, when trauma begins to stack up on itself, as often racism does, it's not just about a singular event. It's many events. And not only that, we're talking about trauma that's collective. And so we're talking about trauma that didn't just affect me. When I see Ahmaud, when I saw what happened to him, I'm linked to that trauma because his story in this country is tied to mine. So trauma is not just about me, it's about a community. And wow. I can talk about it more, much more than that. But right now, trauma stacked on top of each other, and it's across community.
Wow. So it's important for our audience to understand, one, just like, you know how they said, I never forget one of these television programs, somebody was deleting their phone and they said, well, I deleted all my texts. And somebody said, no, it's never really gone away. You think it's deleted, but it's really stored in your device. That's what trauma is. It's stored in our body as if it's hardware, as it a part of our hard drive. And even though you may have repressed it, ignored it, and maybe don't sense it, sometimes it comes to life. So it's stored both physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Let me go over here to Charles. Charles, going back to when we were walking the streets of Montgomery, going from the lynching memorial to the Legacy Museum, we did Rosa Parks. I'm curious for you. I'm going to try to pull something from you. When you saw Ahmaud's death, did any of Montgomery come back to your mind?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's I guess, you know, that there's the National Memorial of Remembrance, which is really a commemoration of all those who have been lynched. And these sorts of extrajudicial killings, I mean, it's just a modern day version of lynching. It's not as ritualized, not as publicized, in the sense that, you know, they put up notices and people gather, but it's very similar in its dynamics. And I think it comes out of the similar place. And I think it also has, I think Jazzy mentioned, a similar intent, and that is to inspire fear in Black folks so that we will stay, quote unquote, in our place. So all that was, I mean, it's all kicked up, you know, and yeah, absolutely.
See, and just to tell our audience, there's a book that I would reference everyone to see called Without Sanctuary. At the turn of the last century, when white people were lynching Black people, they would take a picture around the carcass, whether it was burning or hanging, and then they would gather both men and women and children around the carcass, like they caught a fish, and then send that picture as a postcard to family members around the country so that they can rejoice that they found a Black man or Black woman to hang and to destroy and dehumanize. I think in some ways this video did not come out, but I think it was similar to this postcard because somebody was filming this dude's lynching.
Yes.
And then they were sending it around to their friends to memorialize, look, we found us a nigger today and look what we did.
Yes.
And then somebody in here had a conscience and sent it out, and that's how we became aware of it. Rebecca, you were saying yes. Well, how did Montgomery come back to you in this?
I think one of the things that strikes me about the experience in Montgomery, there's a plaque on the wall at the entrance to the lynching memorial that speaks of lynching as a form of terrorism. And, you know, I came of age in the midst of terrorism being defined as something that happened internationally, right? My reference point to terrorism is someone from another country intentionally attacking the United States. And so my first reaction to that was, no, I'm not terrorized as a Black person. Like, I mean, I pushed back against the word and the concept, only to, as I walked through the lynching memorial, start to tap into, actually, I feel that way. I can feel the tenseness in my body. I can feel my pulse start to race. I can feel my breath start to be short. I can feel the fear and anxiety start to lodge in me. And then again, images that are part of my lifetime and my experience start to flash across my mind. And even as this story comes up, there is that fear and there is that terror. And you realize that I need a broader understanding, a deeper understanding of what is actually happening to me and to our community as we watch these things on cell phone videos and dashboard cams and Facebook Live.
Wow. Jazzy, your head was just bopping up and head. Were you resonating with her comments?
I was. I mean, I think the kind of reimagining or redefining terror and racial terror, is something that like EJI has done really great work to help us understand lynching as racial terror. And so I was agreeing in that. I was just like amening with my muting on, so I don't have to go too much deeply in that.
Okay. And when she says EJI, the events that we talked about in Montgomery, it's a part of the Equal Justice Initiative that was started by Brian Stevenson some years ago. And many of you might have seen his movie, Just Mercy, with Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan. Let me tap into Joshua for a little bit. So I want to tap back to Montgomery for you. Did you connect immediately when you had all that fear and anxiety when you heard about Ahmaud's death to what we experienced two years ago when we were in Montgomery?
Yeah, I think back to the memorial. So they have the physical monuments above your head, but I remember we walked on the path and they showed kind of like descriptions of why the person was lynched. And so it was, they looked at somebody the wrong way, or they were somewhere they shouldn't have been. And so when I started to hear, oh, he was a burglar, or there was a burglary in the area, it kind of took me back to that place where it's another excuse. It's another thing that was brought up to make this seem legitimate when it truly is not legitimate. And so, I mean, I'm somebody who runs, not all the time, but now we can't go to the gym, so I run. And I remember going through my neighborhood or not my neighborhood, a neighborhood that's adjacent to mine, and there's a lot of nice houses there. And one day it started to get a little bit late, and I was like, I guess I should probably get home because I don't want anybody to think that X, Y, C, A, B, C, and D is going to happen. And even as I got closer to my house, I had one of my Black neighbors come outside and tell me, hey, you should go home. It's getting dark. And so just those things came to my mind as I've been reflecting on the situation.
In Vicksburg, Mississippi in the 90s, I don't want to hear how old you were, Josh or Jazzy, at that point, but my great uncle died. And I remember he was an evangelist in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And I remember gathering right before the funeral and then the repast happening with all of his friends coming around in the house with my auntie. And I said, just tell me, what was the experience growing up here in the 40s and 50s? And they said the most horrifying time of the week was Friday night through Sunday, because a lot of white people would get drunk and they would shoot us like we were squirrels. So them just living at that space, it was horrifying just to get at the end of the work week to know that your life was at risk. So I want to talk a little bit about something that's going to touch on us emotionally. Before we start,
can I add something to what you just said?
Go ahead.
Because I think one of the things that you've named and you've kind of painted a picture for us about lynching and kind of a historical context. And I think it's really important for us, especially because of this conversation, to name that it was a deeply Christian practice, that like lynching was a Christian ritual in some sense of people would go to church and leave church and on Sundays go to a lynching and take those pictures that they sent on postcards. And so it's not something that we say those white folks over there that were doing it. These are like Christian folks who were doing this. And naming that, it was like a Christian ritual, like to do that after church as a family.
Well, if we're going to be real honest before we move to law, here's the deal when you go to the lynch memorial. Most of the people lynched were Christian people. And most of the people that lynched those Christian people call themselves Christians. So we got a phenomenon where people are calling on the name of Jesus, and yet Jesus, in some cases, in their minds, empowering them to terrorize other people who are equally followers of Jesus. So we're going to put that in a toolkit and try to unpack that with our theology. Now, one of the things that happens in all this mess is that what Wendell started talking about was how they're going to get away with it now. And what that means is the idea is that we have laws in our country that helps us to manage when someone is murdered. Rebecca, as a lawyer, a former defense attorney, please unpack why this brother was murdered in February and we're just not getting a grand jury in May. I mean, that's not how it normally happens, especially since you have good evidence of who the perpetrators were.
Right.
So can you help us understand why do we need a grand
So
jury
I think,
than we normally have? Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes this such an infuriating experience, is that this happened in February and we are now in May, and we're just at the very beginning of the legal process, which is completely unnecessary. So just a caveat, I do not practice in the state of Georgia, but my understanding from some research is that grand juries are the way that charges are formally brought together in the state of Georgia. And so that a grand jury needed to convene appears to me to be something that's appropriate under Georgia law. What's out of sync here is that it took a months for that to happen. And while that was taking so long, these two perpetrators who were on a 911 call identifying themselves, and then also on video clearly identified, and who were identified by not one, not two, but three district attorneys before any action was taken. That's what is so infuriating and heartbreaking, and also familiar. So what's out of sync here is that these perpetrators were allowed to walk free during this entire process. My understanding from the press conference that was held this morning is that once the third prosecutor got into place, it took him less than 72 hours to review the file, to look at the film, and then say there is clearly evidence here of probable cause, and probable cause is sufficient to execute an arrest. And so probable cause legally is simply a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed. What came to my mind when I reviewed those words just over the last couple of days is the case of Freddie Gray, right? And if you remember, this is the young man that was walking down the street and was apprehended by police and then died in the back of an ambulance en route. And at the time, police mentioned that there was, quote unquote, probable cause to arrest him for what essentially amounted to a switchblade in his pocket. So the double standard that we're looking at is probable cause comes into play for someone like Freddie Gray immediately. And then he is apprehended and taken into police custody immediately. And yet these two perpetrators who self-identified on the 911 call and whose identity was clearly visible to three prosecutors, it took months for that to happen. So that's what feels out of whack. And then I can also relate to Wendell's concern that this is the beginning of a legal process. This is not the end. We are nowhere near a conviction or a sentence that feels anything like justice for this young man and for his family, for this community, and frankly, for this country. And so my hesitation, I feel the same hesitation that Wendell spoke of, that this is the beginning. And I'm not at all confident that the end result will be something that feels like justice. And I think something that Joshua said also sticks with me. We're talking about innocent behavior being criminalized, trivial, meaningless behavior, like crossing a street or wearing a hoodie or looking at someone or speaking to someone. What yesterday was perfectly legal, today is now allegedly illegal and has cost a young man his life.
So help me to understand this part, and then I'm going to pose a different part for you, Wendell. So help me to understand how the legal process is equally traumatizing as the event that we see. Is that the case?
You're asking me, Jimmy?
No, I'm asking Wendell, the therapist. So help me to understand, how is the memory and the legal process as equally traumatizing as the actual physical violence? Or is that
well, in my traumatized brain, my amygdala says don't trust. My limbic system has a history of intake of injustice and where people have been let go. And so if that is in my limbic system, when I saw the video, that part of my limbic system began to go off and go, there have been so many times my brain has known where there legally it has not been that difficult, but how in some way they have gotten off. So even as I hear Rebecca has given a sound steps of what this means. And yet hearing that in my brain, I still hear it doesn't mean a thing. Because there's the law that's out there, but my experience is different. And so my experience, the law doesn't convince my experience, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. So I want to ask another question, but I want to tell our audience, if you got questions coming up, please write them on the Impact page for Facebook or on YouTube, and our producers behind are going to let us have these questions. So here's a question I want to ask Jazzy, Joshua, and Charles. Do you trust the law to do due diligence at this time? Right now in the process, do you actually trust that we're going to get to a place of justice for the removal of Ahmaud's life, Arbery's life? And let's start with you, Jazzy, then Charles, and Joshua.
Absolutely not. Yeah, there's nothing that has shown me to trust the law. I think there's a bigger question, and perhaps a even bigger conversation around what is our understanding of justice that I think is challenging, and I won't get into right now. But I don't trust that these folks will, well, might they be persecuted? Maybe, because of all the clarity of what you said, Rebecca, is true. But right now I don't have any trust in it. And that comes from all the things that Rebecca named. And I also wanted to point out in what she was saying too, around like these innocuous like behaviors that are criminalized, how that's not new, right? Like how that is, right? Like that's what the black codes were, right? Like you can't stand somewhere without being arrested, because then it becomes vagrancy, that you can't walk somewhere, that you can't talk to someone, as you named earlier, right? Like, so if the law has always been against me and my body, how can I ever believe that it will work for me? And what does that even mean, for it to work for me or someone like Ahmaud to see justice? And then you could get into all the problematic ways in which we understand justice, but I won't right now.
Okay. Charles, what do you think? Do you trust this process? Do you trust the law is going to finally become true for us as citizens of this country?
Well, the short answer is no. I think that I'm hopeful, that somebody will step forward and see that justice is done, but, the history would suggest otherwise. And so I think that, whether it's, the resources that are brought to bear, the mobilization of resources from outside this community to provide some sort of legal defense for these gentlemen, from certain aspects of the conservative Christian community, all of that leads me to believe that it's if you would ask me today, I'd say it's a coin toss, whether anything whatsoever will be done to them. And the fact that they're white men increases the probability that they will walk away from this without any consequences. So I think it's and and right now, the whole concept of the rule of law is being attacked at the highest level in the country. And so, I do think it's going to embolden those who perceive the rule of law as meaning the suppression of Black, brown, and the genocide of Native people. That's what the history of this country says it means. That they're going to see this as another excuse or rationale or encouragement to make sure that these men are find a way out of the criminal justice system, and that the message is sent very clearly to Black and brown people that this is not your country.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And Josh, what about you? Do you have a faith that an outcome is going to occur?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of with Charles, where maybe the way things have transpired up until this point, as far as I can see, there's no indication that it will.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the video seems to have been available to those who would have made some of these decisions, but the fact of the matter is, it took public outcry for there even to be an arrest.
Yes.
So that makes me feel as if there's less likelihood that there will actually be a prosecution and a conviction. And it's also just sad that something that on paper, murder, should be open and shut. We saw the video, it's open and shut, shouldn't even be a question. But that in and of itself is part of why, I'm just sorrowful. I'm mourning that everybody in the world can see this. But yet it took months for there even to be an arrest. And so that in and of itself just I don't know, it's hard not to feel depressed when that's the reality.
Well, I want to give some clarity here. First of all, the county did not bring this before the grand jury. It's the Georgia Bureau of Investigation that is leading this. So it's like the FBI, but that's for the state of Georgia. So we need some clarity there, because it seems like they didn't have a sense of conscience to engage it. So the state investigative body took over.
Can I piggyback something?
Well, I just want to add a further step. Like, post this, that I will have to now justify if the injustice happens, I will then have to again prove that I'm not crazy.
Yep.
I would then be pressed to almost have to prove that injustice is happening to me, because that will be used to say, see, that didn't happen. And almost what people of color have to go through constantly is to try to help folks understand that we're not crazy, that this is happening. We don't have to make this up. And I feel it in my body coming. That if they don't, yeah.
But there's a neurosis just in our existence on this planet. The microaggressions every single day we manage our clarity, our lucidity, whether we will be depressed. It's a wonder why we have hypertension, diabetes, and all these things that's killing us from COVID-19. We're prey to this because of events like this. Rebecca, go ahead, and then I want to make another comment. Go ahead.
I just want to add, you're asking Jimmy, do we have some faith that justice will win the day? And quite frankly, the narrative has already started against this being classified as a murder, because the second prosecutor to recuse himself, generally when one recuses himself, it's done in with some discretion and with a modicum of really silence. But there's a very public memo and report coming from this second prosecutor who'd already concluded that the actions of the perpetrators were lawful based on stand your ground rules, and this entire narrative around this young man and the story, before we have any real move on the part of the justice system, you already have state actors alleging that this is not what it appears to be. So there's the narrative, and before we got on this call, there's already been a creation of a Facebook group of Christian people on behalf of the perpetrators that already has tens of thousands of members and is quoting scripture to justify and stand behind these men and the action that they took. So the narrative is already started on all sides, both legally and spiritually, which leads to what Wendell is saying. Even if, regardless of the outcome of this case, there's a narrative that we will fight going forward as the Black community to insist that this was murder, that this was a lynching, that this is unjust, and this is evil at its worst. And we will fight to keep that narrative in place, no matter what happens in the legal system.
All right, so we're about to pivot for a little bit, and I'm going to go to Charles, but I want to give this last thing of why I don't believe it's going to happen. We've already been seeing videos, and I can tell you the first time, no one had phones at that time, but there was a video camera that recorded Rodney King getting beat down by a whole bunch of cops. And I can tell you across the nation, even though it was in LA, we all said with a big sigh, now everybody can see how we're abused. Now everybody can see what they've done to this black body. What was it, like 10-1? And the understanding was, now that it's on video, he's going to be found guilty. I mean, these cops going to be found guilty. And then now we can live as black people. And the riots came. It was a small riot after OJ. The riots came when all of those cops were exonerated by a jury and said not guilty. And then that's when upheaval came. So I knew when everybody saw him get beat down on a videotape, it didn't matter what I saw about Walter Scott, or it didn't matter what I saw about Eric Gardner. And I'm not sure about this because now I know that they can see something recorded and not edited and still not be provoked to see value in my black body. Now let's pivot the conversation to the part I want to move ahead. But again, I want to invite everybody here. If you have questions for us, please send them to us. We want to answer questions. But I want to get to Charles, and then I'm going to go around. Most of us on this video are engaged in some sort, either previously or currently, in campus ministry, whether it's Cru, Impact, or InterVarsity. We spend our lives because we love Jesus, and we see the value of introducing people to follow and know this Jesus. Yet, we see that Jesus is used as a means to affirm this volatility, to affirm this trauma, to affirm this violence. So, Charles, here's the question, dude. What's wrong with our theology? Is it because it's reform or dispensational? Is it because it's Catholic? Is it because it's Anabaptist? Tell me, what's wrong with our theology that allows white people from all different segments to adhere to this type of either passivity? Passivity means that they don't do anything. They're just silent, or their activity by supporting this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty ancient, actually. I think it goes back. I think it goes back to what some call Constantinianism. When Constantine converted to Christianity, those who had once been persecuted now were in the positions of power. And if you study the history, it's startling how quickly they began to turn to use violence to settle their theological disputes. And that spirit has really woven through the history of Christianity in Europe in particular, because that's where it became dominant. And they exported that mindset around the world through imperialism. And so, you know, I think Kelly Brown Douglas calls it Platonized Christianity. It's based on Plato's philosophy, a dualism that, you know, says there's a spiritual world and the physical world, and the physical world is evil. And in the way it's morphed in the current day in the United States, Black is perceived as evil. And to be white is perceived to be more spiritual. And so there's this dynamic that takes place that, you know, in a season like now, when, you know, all the media reports tell us that those who are losing their jobs are working class people, right? We know we're overrepresented in those numbers, but there are a whole lot of white folk who are in those numbers too.
That's right.
And I think there's an impulse to want to establish or protect their privilege. You know, you know, that they historically, you know, if you look at lynchings and all of those things, there was this putting their foot on Black folks' neck in order to say, at least I'll stand above somebody, right? In times of economic hardship. And so I think that the racism that surrounds these kinds of events, the rallying cry that comes up, I think taps into that very deep sense of America, this perverted sense of exceptionalism in America. And Barack Obama tried to turn it into something different. But American exceptionalism has historically been an excuse for a whole lot of mess done to Native people, done to Black, done to our Mexican brothers and sisters historically. And so I think that, that there's that strain that runs through, and it's I would argue it is very clearly heresy because it fails to honor the image of God in every human being. And yet it's present in a great deal of the history of European Christian theology.
Now, I want to ask you, Jazzy, to tap into this question, and then afterwards, we have a question that from our audience to us. But Jazzy, you're moving now from campus ministry into seminary. You're now getting trained and expanding your idea of critical thought in theology. How is this resonating with you as well? This whole idea that Jesus is being affirmed in this volatility towards our own body.
Yeah. Seminary is a continuation of beginning some of that critical thought that started for me in the time of the Ferguson uprising, honestly, where I had to start doing that work as I was serving Black and Brown students and students of color. And I want to build on Charles's point. You spoke of this Constantinian Christianity, and I agree that this happened very early on theologically. And I want to point out theologically this idea that we've missed in the gospel, that when you're saying yes to Jesus, you're saying yes to a new radical family. And that the very act of becoming Christian is actually the act of grafting yourself into communities of people that were never supposed to be together in the first place, which is the heart of the early church that we see in Acts. And I think there are scholars like Dr. Willie James Jennings at Yale Divinity School who does this really, really well and engages around how supersessionism, basically the idea of this Eurocentric image and understanding of Jesus being placed over and erasing Jews from their own story of Judaism, which Christianity comes from. And when they were able to erase Jews from the story, then they could make Jesus whoever they wanted Jesus to be. And Jesus became a reflection of this Eurocentric idea. And then coming into this land, into this soil, then it could always be centered on this Eurocentric Jesus, which turned into this American exceptionalism that you're naming. And in that, we miss the whole story of what it meant for Jesus as a Jewish man to come to Jewish people and bring good news to Jewish people, and then the form of Gentile inclusion, where it was good news for everyone. And part of being a part of the church and saying yes to Jesus meant that you had to become family with these folks.
Right.
That you had to all have your needs together, that your bodies meant the same thing to you as your family that you already had in blood, right? The kinship network was broken open. And we've missed that. When people say yes to the gospel, that's what that means. And that's why we see things like this, where they didn't see that brother as their family. If they cause themselves God-fearing people saying that's not their family. They destroyed his body because they didn't see him as human. And yet they still puppet some type of Christianity in which that would allow for them or protect them under some form of law and order. It makes no sense. And I think it did happen very early on.
So it's a couple of books that are being referenced right now is The Christian Imagination by Willie Jennings. I will recommend you read it. It's a good read. Also, it's not a Christian book, but I think it's heavily theological. It's stamped from the beginning by Ibrahim Kendi. It's a National Book Award from 2 years ago, and it weaves in the idea of white superiority that really flood the gates of theology in the formation of this nation. So that's something that I would really recommend our audience to consider. So
can I say one more?
Go ahead.
I think Jennings, also his Acts commentary, like going through the book of Acts with his commentary, is really powerful as well.
And Jennings, since you mentioned his name, has a brand new book coming out in the next 4 weeks that's going to be talking about whiteness again. So that's another good book by Willie Jennings. He's a professor at Yale. Let's look at this question and see if we can get some help from the outside. Rebecca McLeod, She says, so as Christians, how do we address the narrative? Okay. We haven't heard from Wendell in a while. As Christians, how do we address this narrative? Use your discipline, but then go outside of that as well. How do we address this narrative?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I see that is most disturbing is that often my narrative is being decided for me. And so when people of color, I think whiteness often says it decides their narrative. And what I want to suggest is, no, I as a white man get to decide my narrative. And I think when I hear the word narrative, of course we think about story. And I think one of the ways that we address the narrative is that we got to tell the truth about the narrative. Yeah. We got to come to be able to honor the narrative. And if we honor the narrative, then I believe we can move. But if we can't honor the narrative that this country has, as well as honoring the narrative of the scriptures, if we can't do any one of those, then we do nothing. But to honor the narrative of Jesus, but then to honor the narrative of where we have come from as a country and be able to tell the truth shall make you free. That is what the scripture says. So that's, yeah.
Now for you, Josh, you work, wait, go ahead. Charles, you going to say something?
I got something I'd like to add in here.
Go ahead.
Because a lot of us have been involved in campus ministry. A lot of times when our young people go off to college, they get exposed to campus ministries and they hear about a lot of Bible teachers and authors and whatnot who are not from the African American tradition. And I want to really challenge this next generation to become experts in the Black church tradition. You may not hoop and holler, but you need to understand that legacy and that spirituality, because that's what allowed your ancestors to survive slavery and lynching. And it's still going on. And they weren't killing each other like we are today. So I'm just saying, I think we need to not get caught up in the Eurocentric education that we've all been subjected to. We need to do our own work and learn about our own history, our own scholars, whether it's Benjamin Mays, just the whole lineage of Black theologians who have really helped to document that tradition that allowed us to survive these things, because we need that kind of spiritual energy today. Praise God for the women's theologians that God has raised up, a couple that I've mentioned, who have helped us to recognize the sort of patriarchal ways in which we've approached some of these things. But we really got to wrestle with our own lineage. So John Truth was a theologian.
Amen.
In the movie, Harriet Tubman was a theologian. And we need to recognize this and appreciate the legacy that we've inherited and not look to other folk to try to validate what we know is true about God and what our forebears knew was true about God. And to really allow that tradition to speak to our generation today. That's one of the things I'm trying to do in my work as well. So, but I just want to challenge this next generation. Don't get caught up in the latest white evangelical theologian or white liberal theologian for that matter. We need to study our own tradition and draw the resources out of that so that we have what we need to deal with this nonsense that's going on around us, sometimes which calls itself Christian and ain't.
That's right. So Joshua, as a young person now on campus, I say young, not that no one here on this call is not young, you're just younger. Help me to understand, what's your task to do what Charles says to this next generation? How do you see your work in discipleship to get them not snap food or what was the word that Spike used? Bamboozled into this white evangelical theology and somehow come out loving themselves in their Black body as well as loving Jesus and everyone else around them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it had to start with me because I had to go on the journey or start the journey. I'm still in the beginning stages, but I had to start reading some of those different books. I had to start exposing myself to different pastors and different leaders and different theologians. And as I started to understand the theology from the Black perspective, when students came to me with questions on my campus about somebody called me this or this is happening on my campus, I wasn't necessarily in shock or like paralyzed. I had some things that I could tell them and start to be able to instruct them with the reality that, your identity as an image bearer of God is important. You have dignity and worth. God made you Black, and that is beautiful, and that is worth something. And so nobody can take that from you. So I could start giving them some of these things, and then also helping them to see as they're growing in their faith, they don't have to leave behind their cultural and ethnic identity. And so, I mean, when I was a student and then first on staff, a lot of the shootings were starting to happen. And so we were not starting to happen, but a lot of the highly publicized shootings were happening. And so we would have Bible study, and we don't even have to really bring it up front. Students are coming into our Bible study talking about these issues. And so had to come and figure out, how do we engage the scripture when it comes to justice? How do we engage the scripture when it comes to not just individual justice, social justice, God's justice? Like I said, ethnic identity. And so a lot of things of that nature that I kind of had to do some deconstruction and help other students do some deconstruction in order to help them build up a faith that is not them trying to fit into a hole that is not meant for them to be in or be a part of, if that makes sense. So.
All right, so we have another question. It's very important for everyone in our audience to understand that Black people are being killed all the time. It just doesn't get notoriety. It doesn't get publicity. I can still remember when Alton Sterling was killed and then Philando 2 days later. What people fail to realize, that was 112 and 114th deaths by cops killing Black people in the nation. So there were a whole host of brothers and sisters that were killed that we had no knowledge of. So I don't even know who we would be in terms of trauma if we became aware of how many Black bodies have been demonized or killed. Let's get this next question. Go ahead. Jonathan Rook, can you talk about helpful ways for white staff, specifically who work with impact students, to humbly come alongside and care for our Black students during events like these? That question wasn't for me. I'm the moderator, so I'm going to put that in your hands. Rebecca, we haven't heard you in a while. What would you say to a white staff? The question is, can you talk about helpful ways for white staff, white people, who work with impact students or Black students? So I ain't going to give Jazzy a pass on this one just because they said impact students. They're Black students in IV too. To humbly come alongside and care for Black students during events like these. Go ahead and jump in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So I think one of the things that comes to my mind is this idea that of being anti-racist. This idea that I know that you are in my corner, not necessarily when you step alongside me, but when you step alongside your white friends and counterparts whose behavior and attitudes and perspectives are harmful to me as a Black student, as a Black staff person, as a Black woman. And so I got a situation even today where through social media, in a conversation that was a little contentious with the white brother, and I had a white sister step alongside me and say to this man, let's back up a step or two and think about how this is really affecting me personally, knowing that I'm a mother of a son, knowing that I'm a wife to a man who walks and runs in our neighborhood on a regular basis, right? And so a part of it, I think, is not only solely thinking about what is going on with the Black students that are in your sphere of influence, but what is going on with the white students that are sitting next to them, that are going to class with them. And are there ways that you can actually engage the white community on behalf of the Black students that you know and care for?
Okay, Jazzy, how would you answer that question?
We don't have enough time for me to answer that question. It's a big part of the work that I do. There are a couple of things I'll say pretty practically. One, it is imperative that white staff working with Black students and other students of color do their own work and not make their students their teachers. And so I think even listening to something like this is a part of that. I think the books that Charles and the scholars that Charles is talking about that Black folks need to read, white staff need to read those too, and sit in those and bathe in those. You need to be sitting in Howard Thurman. You need to be sitting in Renita Weems. You need to be sitting in these folks who have made it able for us to sustain also, because that it needs to be something that you're able to integrate within to your own your own being, and not just a checklist as you're loving these students. So do your own work is a big part of it. And that, I would say the second thing, I won't say too many more things. The second thing is, how are you also helping your students connect to Black elders and Black folks who have been sustaining for the healing that they need, right? So part of that is just being able to relinquish that you're just not always going to be the answer and not always going to be the one that can lead these students through what they need. And that's another way in which your life needs to change, because you need to be in closer proximity to Black elders, to other Black folks who you can invite into their lives if you're not able to give that to them.
Amen.
Wow. Oh, that's good word.
That last part was important.
What did you say, Charles?
The last part she said was, all of it was important, but I really just want to ditto that last thing about recognizing you're not going to be the be all and end all of what that student needs. You know, you need to be willing to allow them to find and perhaps point them to mentors from their own culture and community and tradition that can help them navigate some of this. Don't feel like you got to be all of it. Everything else she said was excellent, but I just wanted to underscore that.
Well, I think there's also a character trait that they need to have too, and that's humility. Because you got to understand, in most cases, a Black student who's even 18 showing up on the campus, and you got a white staff, maybe 10 years on crew or university, you got to understand that student is a PhD and understand what it means to be Black in America, and has a lot more life experience, intuition, and understanding than you do. And I don't care how many books you read, you ain't never been called a nigga. And so you being chased down the street or being treated less than is something that you need to keep as a place of humility to engage in. And then to learn how to advocate in the absence of Black people, that tells me how much you love Black people. Because in today's world, when you hear all these atrocities and Black people are around, that tells me the authenticity, that you're not just doing a role, that this is really becoming a part of who you are. I want to transition now to two things before we end. Again, I want to invite people to ask questions for us, as long as we keep moving. But this is a big piece. I don't know about any of you guys, but I had a lot of people tap in and say, Jimmy, how you doing? How you doing? How's your anger? Are you angry? I'm going to really tell you, I was no more angry when I saw the video as it was last week, because I'm so angry at the injustice of COVID-19. I'm so angry of the food deserts that are happening in our neighborhood that, quite frankly, I don't know if I'm not angry. It's just, it's a common part of my daily experience of existence. So I'm gonna start with Wendell and go forward. In this Christian evangelical thing, it seems like anger gets a bad rap, that we're not supposed to be angry, and that God doesn't want us to be angry, and angry is not a great disposition for a Christian. Is that true?
Unequivocally, no. Be angry, but do not sin. My anger is not a sin. And what's true, when I get that question from my white brothers and sisters often, so how are you doing with your anger? Internally, I already go, uh-oh, I'm going to be asked to calm it down. It's not going to be handled well, because I'm often seen, especially as a Black man, my anger is dangerous. And what I want to say as a believer and as a man who loves Jesus, that my anger, of course I can bring anger that's harmful. Of course I can. But my anger in itself is very much of Jesus. And my anger is actually very useful, because my anger says no to injustice.
Mhm.
And what I hope my anger invites you to be angry at evil too.
Mhm.
And so I think when it comes to, I often tell my white brothers and sisters, I want you to contend with my anger.
Mhm.
And my anger deserves to be continued with, because my anger is a righteous anger that I believe Jesus is also angry with me.
Mhm.
Wow. And Josh, you're on the journey as well. You just haven't accumulated as many miles as Wendell. But in your conflict from moving from a student to campus ministry, tell me what has been your struggle to engage anger as an emotion that is not repressed, but is something that you embrace?
Wow. What a journey it has been. I think the more I learn about history, the more I learn about truths that have been kept, the more it's hard not to be angry. You know, the James Baldwin quote, it's hard not to be angry all the time. And so I think the more I see things, like I said, that I didn't realize, and I'm like, this is in the Bible. Like, justice is in the Bible. And I see it everywhere in the Bible. Once my eyes were opened up, I become angry, because I'm like, why do we have to fight for this to be heard? Why do we have to fight for this to be understood?
Yes.
And so it's the anger at what seems so obvious to me, not being obvious to others. What seems so intuitive and clear, what doesn't need to be unveiled is just in plain sight. When I see it, I become angry, and it's hard not to stay in that place. I have to take it to God. I'm learning that if I can bring my full anger in God's presence, and He can accept that, then I can be angry elsewhere as well. And God's anger is actually a protective anger. When something is wrong and somebody is hurting, He's not just sad, He's upset. And so that was something that I was even just meditating on the other day as I was processing the event. Just a well of anger welled up inside of me, and I just felt the Lord saying, I'm angry too. And it's okay for you to be angry, because I'm angry. I'm not just sad. I'm not just grieved. I am, but I'm also angry, because this isn't right. And this is my creation, and I hate sin. And so you can be angry too.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit part of my journey.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Rebecca,
it's important that it's important for you to find spaces that can hold your anger. I need spaces. I was on the phone yesterday with a brother who I know I don't have to mince my words, and just to be able to say and be who I was in that moment felt so healing. So may you allow yourself to find spaces to where you can be angry.
Amen.
We have another question. I believe we do. Kayla, is that correct? Do we have another question? Here we go. This is Demetrius Cooper. Do you think we can be free people living under the theology of our colonizers? Uh-oh. Wow, we're going to tap to it tonight. I love this one. Do you think we can be free people living under the theology of our colonizers? Wow. Now, Jazzy,
I know this. I know this brother.
Huh?
I know this brother.
You know this brother. So
I know this brother.
On this one. I know I want to go after Charles, but Rebecca, you want to give a chance?
Before I answer that one, I do want to say that this thing about anger, I think it's important to realize that as Black people, like, we fight against narratives that have been attached to our anger, right? And so when I feel that well of anger that Josh is talking about, what pushes back against me is I cannot come across as the angry Black female, right? And so it's not just a spiritual thing that I'm trying to manage, a theological thing. I'm trying to manage against an image, right, that has been dehumanized, devalued, dismissed, right, in ways in which my anger is not given place because it's attached to this stereotype. And my brothers on the phone have similar things that you fight against as well. So I think that's an important sort of nuance for us to think about is culturally what happens in those spaces. And really, that's a move of evil as well. It's just a nuanced way to dismiss what you righteously have a right to, which is to stand against and speak against that which is contrary to the gospel.
Well said. Well said.
The truth of the matter is, this is what we do to gain the colonizers' credibility. We seek to be palatable, right? And we seek palatability over truth and authenticity. So we'll repress anger to be palatable. And so I would argue that in our evangelical circles of campus ministry, there's a fork in the road. It's anger or assimilation. And we're told we can't be angry. So we don't want to go down that road. So we ignore that one. So we go the road of assimilation. But guess what? On the road of assimilation, are you angry? You're probably more angry on that road of assimilation than you are on the angry road, because you know every day is a day of palatability, a day of being inauthentic, a day of not being who God created you to be, and the thing of you trying to fit and be something what you really are not, in terms of our colonizers. But I want to really answer Mr. Cooper's question here, because I don't want him to think that we're afraid of him. We can be free people living under the theology of our colonizers. Rebecca, you want to give a shot? Because Jazzy's sitting here smiling, ready.
I got lots of thoughts.
I will defer to her in 1 second, but I do want to say one thing about this. For me, I have had to learn to recognize the theology of a colonizer, right? Like I was born and raised in that. Like I'm closer to Nehemiah because I've never been to Jerusalem. I wasn't raised in Jerusalem. I was raised in captivity. So what I know, what I was fed on is the theology of a colonizer. So to me, the first step in sort of what the question poses is, can I learn to distinguish between what is actually gospel truth versus what is a colonized version or perversion of that truth? And it's not always easy to recognize that.
Preach.
All right, Jazzy, go on and jump in. You ready?
Well, okay. Well, one, I also have to say.
Afterwards, go ahead.
I also have to say to that is just like part of it is also understanding your proximity to your colonizer also, right? That you're naming, Rebecca, because I think some of us, especially as I've working with college students, especially working with college students at some elite universities, how do you tap into the stories of a Daniel or an Esther, right? Who have this high proximity to power. What did they do with their anger? Like when do we get to ask those questions of what was going on with their anger in that time, right? Like you saw Mordecai crying out and you saw his anger, and but what did Esther do with her anger? And I think that's a big question. And that leads me to my response to Mr. Demetrius Cooper here is the first thing I think of when I see your question is back to a reference I made earlier of referencing Howard Thurman. And essentially Howard Thurman in Jesus and the Disinherited talks about how he wants nothing to do with the religion about Jesus, but only the religion of Jesus, right? And the religion of Jesus is being able to fully place Jesus within Jesus's context as a poor, brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who was executed by the state as a mob, and it was a mob mentality, right? So you have mob folk like the ones who killed Ahmaud, right? Or the state, like who have killed many of our other brothers and sisters. And that has a lot to say to us, right? And that is not the theology of our colonizers. That is a theology that they have missed and distorted, right? And so we have to be able to discern the distorted theology that we have inherited that was passed down to create a forcible docility and palatability that Jimmy's talking about, and rather begin to embrace the theology and the religion of Jesus, which Jesus's body is more like ours, right?
Shut up.
And to understand that. So then you engage with a theology that does help you think about fear, that does help you think about anger, that does help you think about self-deception in a way that's not shutting you down, but can help you be more rooted in something that is freeing and liberating, you know?
Wow. Do you want to come in here, Doc? Come on here, Charles. You want to join this part of the conversation?
Yeah, both of those answers are excellent, outstanding answers. The short answer is no. We can't be free living under the theology of colonizers. I think on a very personal level, to tie into the whole anger piece, I think the Psalms are a very rich place of expressing emotion to God, to hearing the emotions of God's people. And in there, you will find some very powerful things around dealing with injustice. My favorite psalm is Psalm 102, where it talks about how God has recorded these things for a future generation, that the people yet to be created will praise the Lord when the kingdoms are assembled and gathered in Jerusalem. So there's a sense in which the scriptures are given to us, oppressed peoples, so that we can recognize the way God deals with folk. And Frederick Douglass said it during slavery, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of I recognize the widest possible difference. And so I think that the issue of discernment is key. I think becoming more acquainted with our forebears, such as Howard Thurman and others who were doing, battle in the heat of the day and understood the Christianity of Christ is a very important thing. And we've got to recognize, I believe in a cultural incarnational ecclesiology. The gospel needs to be implanted in the cultures of the world, incarnated within those cultures. And then each culture has something beautiful and powerful to offer to the global body of Christ. And the African-American Christian tradition has done that. And I think it has the potential to continue to do that.
Come on, Charles.
Those of us who are getting an education will steep ourselves in that tradition so that we can offer those riches to other folk. I am tired of our folk going off to seminary and becoming proxies for white people's controversies. We got to stop doing that. We got to understand what our community needs. We need the resources to deal with these situations like the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. We got to find the resources to deal with the ways in which COVID-19 is devastating our communities, to not allow the things that are being done to us to cause us to have hypertension and to not manage our food consumption so that we're diabetics and all the different, comorbidities they call them, that cause us to die at disproportionate rates. We've got to recognize that in God's word, that the resources are there, but we cannot allow other people to feed us from God's word. We need to be feeding ourselves.
So the big thing in the impact movement, we're adapted. So in the beginning, I used to say thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the idea. But what we're really saying in the impact movement, we have to learn and then unlearn. It's very, very unfortunate, Mr. Cooper, that we use this one-size-fits-all discipleship stuff given to us by our white evangelical brothers, and we disciple people that only to undisciple them out of it in order for them to be fully human, fully Black, and fully in love with God. One of the things I really love about James Cone in God of the Oppressed, he admits in the very beginning that he has a biased lens when he reads the scripture. He comes out of the age of lynching and terrorism among Black people. And what he does, he uses that as a lens for how he reads the scripture. But what he also admits is that he sees a lack of humility from his white brothers and sisters when they look at the text. Because when they look at the text, it's the word of God. It's the unadulterated word of God. It's the idea that they have no bias, John MacArthur. It's the reality that this critical race theory is a threat, and it is a threat to white evangelical thought. And, intersectionality is a threat to white evangelical thought, and social justice is a threat to white evangelical thought. But these three ideas wrapped in our Black bodies, when we see the scriptures, gives us life. And that's what we need to really, really hone in, these skills for us to save this next generation. Because what you're talking about is a recent phenomenon in these past 50 years. 50 years back, there was Vernon Johns. And I don't know if y'all remember Vernon Johns. He was the pastor that preceded Dr. King at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And at the end of his sermons, I remember hearing this from Dean Schreier, he'll pull out from underneath the pulpit a head of turnip greens and some catfish, and started showing what it was to be have commerce in the church. And his old phrase was, "You want to see perpetual motion? Tell a black person to park his Cadillac on land that he owns." And so that was the idea of saying that we need to change who we are. Yeah, y'all probably caught on to that one. That's really bad. Here's the next question right here from Lorna Moss.
Wait, can I just jump in really quickly before you move
Go
on?
ahead.
There's just it's just maybe this is nitpicky. I think the language of saving this next generation as a younger one on the call, I want to problematize a little bit, because I think the things that we're saying, the wrath and the anger and the like embodiment of what has been experienced in the Black psyche and the trauma, the collective trauma of the Black body, this generation of students, they actually like can feel it and express it. And we just need to say to them, yes, this is the gospel also. You know, like, I don't think they need to be right? Like, I think they need to be connected to all the things that we've been saying. But I think we miss sometimes that actually they are in touch with some of the things. They are seeking to embody the things that we've been told that we could not, in ways that are a little bit freer than some of us have had before. But they're not seeing that as fully connected to the gospel and what it looks like to live as someone of Jesus, because they're still being told that that's not God. You know, so I do think that there's something in there that they know that we don't, that we can learn from them, and that together actually is healing for all of us. I just wanted to name that for my young folks.
No, that's true. And when I say saving this generation, what I don't want them to do, I want them to get where I'm going without necessarily taking the path of how I got there.
Yes. Yeah.
Because
we need to sustain this generation. The question is sustaining them more than anything.
Exactly, because white evangelicalism in the early part of my years didn't even see me as Black, did not affirm anything African. Drums in Africa were to the demons. But, you know, I don't care anybody said Led Zeppelin on them cat was building on drums too. And what's those crazy people over in Australia that do all the music for it? They're beating on drums too. And so this is a ridiculous, I forgot what you call these people over there. Something song. I can't remember. Hillsong. All this crazy people over there. So all I'm saying is we're taught not to love ourselves, and we have to unteach ourselves to see how beautiful God was in us, not just in the text, but in our history. So I got one more question, and then I want to end with a question that I want all of you to answer before we go. What is our posture perspective supposed to be as Black Christians when we see the rampant disparity in our country? How do we keep ourselves and others encouraged and work on healing from the trauma? All right. We haven't heard from you for a little bit, Josh. I know y'all want to look at this, but y'all got to think on the road. So whoever goes first gives y'all a little bit of time. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, big question. I think one of the things that comes to my mind is therapy. Honestly, I think that's one of the things that comes to my mind. And it's just as I'm engaging my own journey, I'm seeing so much of my own just trauma from racism in my past and present. And so it's helped to have some intentional time and space to work on that, and instead of allowing it to continue to eat me from the inside out, and allow it to leak out in unhealthy ways. So that's one thing I think about. Community and having spaces to express just freely. Those things are something else that I think about. I think about music as a therapeutic, which is something that I think has been a part of our history for forever. And so those are just a couple initial thoughts. But it's hard because we have lives to live, and so all of life can't be a counseling session, but more of it needs to be, at least for me. So those are some initial thoughts.
Go ahead, Wendell. We haven't heard from you for a while. We're over you on the other side of the corner.
Yeah, I think what comes to my mind is when I think about healing from trauma, here's what's true. The brain can heal. The heart can heal. And so I believe as we think about trauma, our amygdala also records
Now
good
wait a
memory.
minute, Pete, you keep speaking in tongues on us.
Yeah.
I, I, I,
What?
I, I was
Well,
actually
yeah, I
going to tell you what that is.
What is that thing you talking about?
I was actually going to tell you what it was.
All right.
And when I said amygdala, we're talking about the limbic system. We're talking about your survival system in your brain. And we often hear it as your survival system, but you know what? It also records counter and new, fresh, and healing narrative. So I believe when it comes to healing trauma, and I just want to go back to what Josh said. Man, find you some spaces for folks help you walk through your story, help walk you through your trauma, and join you in your trauma. And you get to invite Jesus because Jesus knows trauma. Jesus knows trauma well. And I believe Jesus wants to interact with us in our trauma and bring freedom from our trauma. So that's my short answer to that. But I believe if people know that there is healing, then let that be an encouragement to you.
Well, let's do a brief commercial break and tell people that there's a thing at the Allender Center that that Wendell's a part of called the Story Workshop. It's a very intense process. It's not easy, but it's a place to help you on that journey of correcting your narrative, of finding healing in your narrative. And I know there's one coming up in August. Am I correct, Wendell?
Correct.
So if people are interested, go to the Allender Center website. And, for people of color, this is a growing emphasis that we're doing in the impact movement to help people deal with trauma. Rebecca, I want you to do the last part of this question before I ask a question to all of you guys, and then we're going to close out.
About how to stay encouraged and heal?
Yes.
Yeah. So one thing that I would say, and it alludes to something that Charles said earlier, right? We have a very rich, strong, valiant tradition as Black Americans. And there are things that our ancestors knew and know about how to navigate this land that I think is vital for us, in the sense that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? There are things that I carry in my DNA and in my blood. There's a strength there that comes from those whose shoulders I stand upon. And can I know that and pass that on? We had a situation a couple years ago with a bus driver who singled out my daughter in a predominantly white school district, Black child on the bus. And for weeks, we agonized as a family about how are we going to get her through this. And it finally dawned on me one day, this is a Rosa Parks moment. Like this, I mean, I know it's 2000 and something, and I know, I'm not in Georgia or Montgomery. I'm in Williamsburg and all this, but it dawned on me, this is a Rosa Parks moment. And I'm one of those parents that my kids have been to the Rosa Parks Museum. My kids, we live a mile from where the first slave ship hit U.S. soil. My kids have walked that ground. My kids have walked the last stop on the Underground Railroad in Canada. And so when I said to my daughter, this is a Rosa Parks moment, she instantaneously knew how to conduct herself. And so did I. Like my questions, my anxieties, my worries, they ceased once I was able to click into the narrative that is part of my DNA. And then she knew how to conduct herself, and so did I. And so I feel that that's really key. Like there's nothing that we're facing that is new under the sun. And our elders have been here before. So if I can learn those stories, walk that land, then I all of a sudden I have a map with how to conduct myself. And for me, that's been amazingly healing.
Wow. Now, I want to tell people a couple of questions. I really wanted to move towards action, and we didn't get a chance to. I don't need Ahmad's death to provoke me to know that life needs to be different. I was already there before his death.
Right.
And I'm hoping people won't use this as a stimuli and say, I need to change. You needed to be changing before this happened. But the question I do have, which is more important to you guys that I want to ask versus the action question is this. It's twofold. I had a phone call and somebody said, do you think this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back and we can see the end of this deaths of Black people at the hands of police? So I want to ask y'all this question. Do you have any hope that the death of Ahmaud Arbery would be the end of this narrative and we can have a new narrative? And then if you don't have hope, what hope do you have to allow you to persist on this journey as believers, as Black, and to continue this journey ahead? So I'm gonna start this time with Charles, and I'm gonna swing my way around. Go ahead, Charles.
I don't expect this to just go away because of Ahmaud Arbery's death. I would pray and hope that it becomes another step on a journey to a more just society. And my hope is in Jesus. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, unless there is a revival in this country in which those who support this deeply racist law and order agenda that's very old, I think that, you know, that's not going to change. But that doesn't mean we can't continue to resist, to give witness to what the truth of God is. That's really our legacy as Christians. The first Christians were persecuted. And so, you know, I don't know that it being resolved has to determine our faithfulness to God.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I think, agreeing with Charles, it's hard to imagine that this would be the end because we've seen videos before. Maybe because everyone is home, more people are watching this one. But again, you can hope and we can pray that if there is a revival, that unlike some of the previous revivals where slavery and Jim Crow persisted afterwards, that this one would be different as well. I just don't know. The question just is how long, oh Lord. As far as how do I hope, or where does my hope come from? Of course, it comes from Jesus. It comes from the fact that he did come in a body like ours. He came to a people who were oppressed in the Jewish people, and he proclaimed justice. He proclaimed the year of the Lord's favor. He spoke good news to the poor. And so he promises to walk with us through this. And so there's hope there, no matter what the ending comes. And so I can hold to that. And I can hope in some friends who in times like this reach out and say, I'm praying for you. I see you. You know, I'm recognizing that you're probably in pain right now. So I can place hope in that as well.
Jazzy?
I think my hope is in that those of us who are believers, as we are undergoing like this collective trauma that's been named, the collective grief that has been named, that we would also begin to create a different collective dream, and that we would be able to, as Christians, be critical enough to cast off the fallacy of apoliticism, knowing that if we dream kingdom dreams, then our kingdom dreams are political dreams, and that we have to dream together if all people being able to live life and life abundantly, as Jesus did say, in contrast to the life that the enemy brings of kill, steal, and destroy. And so I think if we can dream new dreams that are fiercely political and create the policies and institutions and the spaces in which everyone can have life abundantly, my hope is in that, because the Holy Spirit does move powerfully and does work miracles.
Wendell?
Yeah, I would say no, but I would also say I come from a resilient people. We have been here before, and so I believe as much as we're wounded, we're also resilient. And even in my resilience, it doesn't mean I don't wrestle with helplessness at times. But again, I come from a people, we know hopelessness, and yet we have been resilient. So I do trust that Jesus will continue to give us the resilience to walk through injustice that I think will continue, unfortunately.
All right. And Rebecca.
Yeah, I have to echo the sentiment that hope is hard on a day like today.
Yes, ma'am.
It almost feels impossible. Do I have any hope that Ahmad will be the last one? No, I don't. I think that my hope is almost a moment by moment thing of the strength to try again, to want more for my kids than what I have, and to raise them with some sense that they can go a little further than the generation before them. And I think also my hope is in the idea that in our resilience, we present the hands, feet, and face of Jesus to the world in a way that causes people to pause and wonder.
Well said.
You know, as a father of 3 Black men, you know, my oldest is 26, around the age of this guy who was murdered, Ahmad. And my second son is 23, and my youngest is 19, and he's a freshman in Morehouse. I hope it will end, but I have no rational evidence to tell me it will end. Because one day, unfortunately, you know, we look at Ahmad, I don't want it to be one of my sons. So I have that hope that, you know, that my sons will live, but I have a hope that it will stop. But my mind tells me it won't. My biggest hope, though, is a concern that we can rediscover what the scriptures mean. We have a very utilitarian, selfish scripture or gospel message in this country where we think knowing Jesus is a Gnostic experience of our spirit, not about our bodies. And it's attached to a place called heaven. When I read the scriptures in the text, Jesus doesn't talk about going to heaven as much as he talks about a kingdom. He talks about a kingdom here, similar to what Jazzy said, similar to what Tom Skinner has mentored and showed me. This idea that the kingdom of God is at hand. And so what I love right now is Luke chapter 4. And I like to read that for us in our hearing right now, because I believe that's what my hope is, that this will be true. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and he was in, as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, as Isaiah 41, if you don't know. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor," people in the COVID-19. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, all those people under the Innocent Project still caught in prison, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's my hope. And I'm hoping that for us in the Impact Movement, that's what we want the students to understand. What we invite people when they meet Jesus, we're inviting the kingdom to come on a campus, the kingdom will come into a home in a neighborhood, the kingdom to go to New York. We're not inviting them just to have a place in heaven and to have all their dreams come true. It's a place to realize God's presence. It's not us going to heaven, but heaven coming to us. I want to thank all you guys. It's been fun. You guys are informative. It's fun to read all these books that are referenced, and that I'm not the only one that quotes books or mentioning titles. Jazzy and Charles, you've done a good job for us. The authenticity of all of your disciplines, your life service, your commitment to our community, to Jesus himself, to everyone, Wendell, Rebecca, Jazzy, Joshua, and my predecessor, the man who left me with this organization to lead, Charles Gilmer. I want to say thank you to all of you, and to everyone who hung out with us for an hour and 40 minutes. Thank you. This is recorded, and I appreciate all you guys. Tune in Monday at 8 o'clock because we're going to be talking to 2 national campus ministries to talk about the challenges of how do we really do ministry in a digital age to Black students and students of color. So thank you again. Please, guests, stay on until we get this closing song. Good night.